So, hi, in today's lesson we're going to be looking at the aperture of the camera. The aperture is all to do with how much light we let into the camera. Now you can be really creative using the aperture. You can allow more light to come in, then you can create what we call shallow depth of field images, or you can allow less light to come in. If there's less light, then it means that there'll be a large depth of field, which means more of the picture will be sharp and in focus. So today is about learning which techniques work best for the type of images that you want to create. So the aperture is the iris of the camera, and it's all to do with how much light that you let in. And remember, when you're taking a photo, you are taking a photo of something three-dimensional that then becomes encapsulated. You have your foreground here, you have your midground, and then way back here you have your background. So through the aperture you decide on what part of the picture you want in focus. So for shallow depth of field you can create some really beautiful sort of painterly pictures almost, where you will focus either on the foreground or the midground or the background whilst the rest drops out of focus. But if you want to take some really beautiful landscapes and you want to capture all that detail, you want a large depth of field, and then that will show all that detail from the foreground, midground and background. So I hope you find this lesson useful. Enjoy. Thank you. How does the aperture work? So the aperture is like the iris of the eye. It's the hole inside the camera lens that lets in the light. So the aperture controls how much light enters your camera, and you can either make the hole smaller or bigger. So the more light that you let into the camera, the brighter the image will be. If it's too much light, then we call that overexposed. And if there isn't enough light that comes into the camera, then the image will be darker. And if it's too dark, then we call the image underexposed. So how do you change the aperture on the camera? Well, if you look here, you've got your dial here. Now I've got the setting here on M for manual. You can put it on A for aperture priority, but for now manual means that you've got full control of the camera. So you turn the dial here by increasing the number or decreasing the number, and then you press the plus or the minus to change the aperture settings on the manual setting. If you have it on the aperture priority, you just need to turn the dial here. So definition, depth of field. This means how much is in focus in your photo. Is the foreground and background in focus? So you decide how much of the image you want sharp. Do you want the foreground, the midground and background, or just one section of the picture? So this image here of mine from my Power of Touch series shows a shallow depth of field. So we can see here with the hands here, the focus is here, and then the arm of my daughter, her arm is dropping off in focus. So the emphasis is very much on the hands being connected together. And this is what we call the shallow depth of field. Another image here of the bluebells that I've taken. So my point of focus is here on this bluebell, and I've used a really shallow depth of field to create this very sort of dreamy image where the background completely blurs out of focus. So when you've used in your camera, you can see here, this shows your aperture settings here. So f3.5. Now some lenses will allow you to open up to 1.4, and on a 50mm lens that's really good, because that means then you can take some really shallow depth of field images and shoot in low light. And this symbol here shows that this is your aperture and the hole is large. So at 3.5 the hole is large, and we call that shallow depth of field. So that naturally lets in more light, but less is in focus. In contrast, we have a large depth of field. This is where the foreground here, where the window is sharp. Here the kitchen table, the bag is sharp, midground, and all the way to the background of the kitchen here is sharp. So it means every part of the image is sharp. And the same with this image as well. So we've got the playground area, and even the houses and the lights and the starburst street lamps are sharp as well. So that's a large depth of field. And this is what your camera would look like on the back. So you can see here the hole is much smaller. So you will set your camera to a higher number like f22, and it means then the hole is a lot smaller. So that means a lot less light comes into the camera, but then the picture will be more in focus. But if the hole's smaller, you need to make sure that your shutter speed is longer to compensate. And the same goes for the aperture of a wide aperture, say f3.5, and that's a lot of light, so then you need to use a shorter shutter speed. So it's a constant balancing act between time and light. And here we've got a simple diagram of just showing how this works. So we've got my camera setting here. So I've taken this picture here at 1.8. So this is a shallow depth of field, and you can see the background is completely out of focus. And this is the most shallow depth of field I can set my camera to. And gradually, as we increase the depth of field, so we're now at 2.8, now the shutter speed is half as slow. So the last one, we go back, was 3,200, and now it's at 1,600 of a second. Okay, so if this starts to get smaller, then this needs to start to become longer. And as you follow this, now we're in a sort of mid depth of field, so you can see the background slowly coming into focus. We're now at 5.6, which is a sort of average mid depth of field, and then the shutter speed has now become even longer, so it's 500th of a second. And f8, and gradually this number will increase, and then this shutter speed will become longer. So now this is 200th of a second. And more of the background starts to come into focus. f11, and now 100th of a second. And you can see it's becoming sharper as we increase. And then this particular lens will stop down to f16. So that means that is the smallest setting that I can set my depth of field to. So that's the large depth of field, and we can see the foreground is sharp and the background is coming into focus too there. But then you can see my shutter speed is at 50th of a second. So it's always important to remember the relationship between the aperture and the shutter speed. So large depth of field is when the whole picture is sharp, where you may be photographing a landscape or architecture and you want the foreground, midground, background sharp. Shallow depth of field is where you decide which part of the image you want to be in focus. And it doesn't have to be the foreground, it could be the midground, it could be the background. But it's all about you directing the viewer's eye to what you want to be emphasized in the photo. So that's how the aperture works.